He had nothing. No parents, no safety net. No future anyone believed in. His name was Hans Wilsdorf, and by 12, he had already lost everything. No money, no connections, no clear path forward. And yet, decades later, that same name would be behind Rolex, a brand worth tens of billions, worn by presidents and icons of success. But here's what makes this story different. The idea that built that empire was once mocked, and at one critical moment he was offered security, if he gave it up. Most people would have said yes. He didn't, and that decision changed everything. 1. Humble beginnings. Hans Wilsdorf was born in March of 1881 in Bavaria, Germany, into a modest but stable family that ran a small iron goods business. For a brief moment, his life followed a predictable path, structured, secure, and rooted in tradition. But that stability collapsed faster than anyone could have imagined. By the age of 12, both of his parents had died, leaving him and his siblings completely orphaned. What followed wasn't protection, it was displacement. Relatives sold off the family business, separating the children from the life they once knew. He was sent to a boarding school in Coburg, a place that offered education but little emotional comfort. There, he became an outsider. Different background, different circumstances, constantly reminded that he no longer belonged anywhere. But instead of collapsing under that weight, something shifted. Isolation turned into focus. He poured himself into learning, developing an unusual strength in mathematics and languages, eventually becoming fluent in German, French, and English. Skills that, at the time, meant nothing emotionally, but would later become everything strategically. Looking back, this period wasn't just hardship, it was conditioning. Being forced to rely on himself so early created something rare: independence without hesitation. While other boys his age were still figuring out identity, Hans was already learning how to operate without support. He later reflected that this forced self-reliance became one of the main reasons for his success. What felt like abandonment at the time was actually preparation. And then something subtle but critical happened. During his years in school, he was introduced to Switzerland through a fellow student. At first, it meant nothing, just another place on a map. But that small connection planted an idea, one that would quietly grow in the background. Because years later, that same country would become the center of his entire empire. 2. The first reinvention. After finishing school, Hans didn't step into anything glamorous. He began working in export companies, learning the mechanics of international trade, how goods moved, how deals were negotiated, how markets connected across borders. It wasn't exciting work, but it gave him something far more valuable: perspective. He started to understand that business wasn't just about products, it was about positioning, communication, and timing. At 19 years old, he made a decisive move. He relocated to Switzerland, the heart of watchmaking. There, he took a job as a clerk in a watch export company, earning a modest salary and doing repetitive tasks, winding watches, checking accuracy, handling correspondence. On the surface, it looked like a dead-end job, but in reality, it was access. He was inside the industry, observing everything from the ground level. And that's when he noticed something no one else was paying attention to. While the entire industry focused on pocket watches, there were small manufacturers experimenting with tiny movements designed for wristwatches. The problem? Nobody took them seriously. Wristwatches were seen as fragile, inaccurate, and most damaging of all, feminine. Men didn't wear them. The market had already decided. But Hans saw something different. He didn't see a limitation, he saw a shift that hadn't happened yet. He became convinced that wristwatches would replace pocket watches entirely. Not gradually, but completely. And this is where the story becomes dangerous, because believing in something the market rejects isn't just risky, it isolates you. 3. Rejection and risk. At 24 years old, Hans moved to London, the commercial center of the world at the time. It was there that he decided to stop working for others and build something of his own. He partnered with his brother-in-law and started a company, importing Swiss watch movements and placing them into cases for resale. It worked. The business grew. But there was a problem. It wasn't his vision. Because what he wanted wasn't just to sell watches. He wanted to create a brand, something almost unheard of in that era. Back then, watches were sold anonymously, often branded by retailers, not manufacturers. But Hans believed the future belonged to names people could recognize and trust. That idea alone went against the structure of the entire industry. Then came a defining moment. He introduced the name Rolex in 1908, a word designed to be short, memorable, and universal. It wasn't random. It was intentional branding in a world that didn't yet understand branding. But even that wasn't enough. The real challenge remained, convincing people that wristwatches were not just acceptable, but superior. And the resistance was brutal. The industry didn't just doubt him, it dismissed the entire concept. But instead of adapting to what was selling, he doubled down on what wasn't. That's the part most people never see. Before success becomes obvious, it looks like stubbornness. And for Hans, that stubbornness would either build everything or destroy it. 4. The breakthrough. The turning point didn't come from gradual acceptance, it came from proof. In 1910, a Rolex wristwatch received official certification for precision in Switzerland, the first wristwatch ever to achieve that level of recognition. It wasn't just a technical win, it was psychological. It challenged the belief that wristwatches couldn't be accurate. But Hans didn't stop there. In 1914, he pushed even further, submitting a Rolex watch to the Kew Observatory in England, the most demanding testing institution in the world. No wristwatch had ever passed their standards before. When Rolex did, it didn't just validate the product, it shattered the industry's core argument against it. And then, history intervened. World War I changed everything. Soldiers in the trenches needed quick, reliable access to time. Pocket watches became impractical. Wristwatches became essential. What the market had rejected, reality suddenly demanded. And just like that, the perception shifted. What looked like a risky bet turned into perfect timing. But it wasn't luck. It was positioning. Hans had built for a future that didn't exist yet, and when that future arrived, he was already there. 5. Empire and legacy. With demand rising, Rolex expanded rapidly. But success introduced new challenges: production, consistency, innovation. And, once again, Hans focused on what others ignored. He became obsessed with durability, leading to the creation of the first waterproof watch case in the 1920s, the Rolex Oyster. It wasn't just innovation, it was differentiation. Then came another leap. In the early 1930s, Rolex introduced the self-winding mechanism, eliminating the need to manually wind watches. These weren't small upgrades, they redefined what a watch could be. And, more importantly, they reinforced the brand's identity: precision, reliability, and excellence. But perhaps his most underestimated move wasn't technical, it was structural. After personal loss, Hans transferred ownership of Rolex to a foundation, ensuring the company would never be sold or controlled by external shareholders. That decision protected the brand's vision long after his lifetime, something most founders fail to achieve. Today, Rolex generates over 10 billion Swiss francs annually and dominates the luxury watch market globally. But the real legacy isn't the revenue, it's the positioning. Rolex didn't just become a watch brand, it became a symbol of achievement itself. From an orphaned boy with nothing to one of the most powerful names in luxury, Hans Wilsdorf didn't just build a company, he changed how the world defines value, precision, and status. His story isn't about watches. It's about seeing what others can't and refusing to let the world convince you you're wrong. So here's the real question. Would you have bet everything on an idea the entire industry rejected? And, more importantly, do you trust your vision enough to hold on to it when there's nothing backing you but belief? Subscribe for more stories like this, because the next empire might start exactly where you least expect it.